One thing I heard before the macroeconomic headwinds were really felt by everyone was really talking about them at least. I would start asking people, are you concerned about this? And they go, no, I'm just concerned about like finding tech talent.
It's a weird time in Canadian tech. Seemingly every day, BetaKit is writing news stories about macroeconomic headwinds and layoffs. And yet, prompted by a single tweet, we've also published a list of over 300 companies actively looking to hire Canadian tech talent. At time of this recording, only 1 week after its publication, it's one of our most popular stories of the year, surrounded by those aforementioned layoff stories. So what the hell is going on? Is it the best of times, the worst of times, or one endless blurst of times? To help us figure that out, on this week's podcast, we have Nora Jenkins Townson, founder of HR consultancy Bright and Early, and Meagan Simpson, newly crowned senior editor of BetaKit. Thank you for joining us, guys.
Hi, congratulations.
Oh, thank you. I guess I just found out when this
when it is airing after September 1st.
You haven't found it out yet.
No, she knows.
That's an amazing people strategy. Announce their promotion in a very public and exciting way. Maybe don't do that, but
yeah. Well, I can't be like shitty old title that she's had for 3 years that we never updated because of HR issues. I think probably the best way to start this is, Meagan, to have you kind of walk us through what prompted your initial tweet that led to an article that now has, probably by the time this recording goes out, well over 350 companies saying, hey, we are hiring Canadian tech talent, downturn or no. And then we can maybe get into the state of layoffs, the state of reporting on layoffs, just what the heck's going on. But why did you tweet? Because you don't often tweet. And when you do, you tweet poorly. So why did you put out a call to Canadian tech companies asking them to let you know if they were hiring?
First of all, I would like to clarify that I do tweet regularly, but I simply tweet my articles or BetaKit articles.
Meagan Simpson also recently Twitter verified as well.
Yeah, so Twitter doesn't think I tweet badly, so there you go. But why did I put out that tweet? Honestly, I was kind of depressed. Having to write a layoff essentially a day. I'm not even kidding. There was a span of 2 weeks where I'm pretty sure either myself or a BetaKit writer on the team was writing a layoff a day. So I was editing a layoff a day.
We were talking before we closed off our day. You were responsible for writing stories on BetaKit representing thousands of employees across Canada being laid off just in the last month.
Yeah, like I alone, I do edit a lot of the stuff that goes up on BetaKit, but I also write, and I wrote some of like the biggest ones, like Shopify, Wellsimple, Hootsuite, like just so many people. And that's not really fun. News is news, right? And as a reporter, you have to do it. But, it's kind of sad when people are losing their jobs or there's kind of this negative news happening for companies when there's been such a boom in Canadian tech over the past couple of years. So I thought there's got to be something else going on. And I think that paired with the fact that one thing I heard before the macroeconomic headwinds were really felt by everyone was really talking about them at least. I would start asking people, I would say, oh, what are you really concerned about? Like, are you concerned about this? And they go, no, I'm just concerned about like finding tech talent. So that, early on in the year, combined with just being very, very sad about having to cover kind of just tough news, prompted, okay, what's the, who's hiring? What positive stuff happening? And kind of went from there.
Okay, so we can dig into that a little bit later, but I probably want to get Nora in here because like it's hard for us to write stories about bad things happening, but we are not responsible for those things. I'm not implying here that you are responsible for bad things happening in the world. Quite the opposite. But I think you are responsible for helping companies make tough decisions and hopefully teaching them to do that in a way that is not horrible. I believe during the pandemic, we had you on the podcast to teach everyone listening how to be laid off or how to lay off in a humane way. I think we're going to draw a lot of corollaries between now and 2020, which is the last time, from at least BetaKit's perspective, we've had to write so many goddamn layoff stories and such a regular cadence. What is your understanding of like the conditions on the ground? It's not the worst of times. So what kind of times are they?
Yeah, you bring me on for the happiest topics. Thank you. Yeah, I too am seeing, all of the stories out there. And on our team, we have helped a few of our clients make difficult decisions over the past couple of months in reducing their teams and helping them do that in a way that it is a little more humane as well, and maybe helps people land on their feet. But, I will say, it's not as bad as it looks. Perhaps I'm biased in that, a certain type of company that's doing well might be engaging consultants a little bit more. But I polled my own team today on, what they're working on. And at any given time, we're working with, 30 plus different startups across Canada and the US and some globally. And only about 10% of them have done any form of layoffs or freezing, and the rest of them are actively hiring right now. There's been some changes to the landscape of what that hiring looks like. But, I would say the vast majority of the startups that we are currently working with are looking to hire.
Is that including the companies that had done layoffs, minor cutbacks, but then still looking for roles? Like, this doesn't seem like to be the en masse, everyone's got to go because we need to save the company, black swan type situation.
Yeah, I mean, I think the companies that did have to do layoffs, or the ones that are in a hiring freeze and just being cautious, I think those ones are not hiring or hiring less. And there's a few conditions kind of leading to that as well, of them being in that spot that hopefully they'll find their way out of. But it's not quite time to hire yet, unless it's kind of a vital backfill or something that's needed to move the business forward in a new direction.
Rob, do you have like a take on this? Like, obviously, we relaunched this podcast by being like, things are so dark, our only solution is to pod about it. That's not been this year, but certainly in our AMAs and otherwise, we've been having conversations about large companies that Meagan's been writing about laying off significant percentages of employees. And you are currently looking to start your own business. Has it never been a greater time for Rob to be hiring?
Oh, totally. I can totally pay in Bitcoin and Ethereum. And well, what's interesting is in Meagan's article, sort of vibes with what I'm hearing around town, which is like, if you actually look at some of the people that are, when the layoffs happened, a lot of them weren't always engineers. And the other sort of through line I've heard anecdotally, that the tech talent that was shed was often not the top tier tech talent. This was an excuse to downsize. So I'm not sure how much of it was economic headwinds and how much of it is, I'm sure most of it is, but there's a lot of like, well, this is the opportunity to do some stuff. So let's do some stuff, which is also what happened at the beginning of COVID, right? Like at the beginning of COVID, a lot of people downsized, not knowing what the hell was happening. As you know, when we started this podcast, it was like daily. Even when Nora came on, it was like daily. This is what's happening today. The law might change tomorrow. Funding might change the day after tomorrow. So you have to do anticipatory let goes. But if you actually look at the list in the article there, a lot of those companies that have let people go are also hiring, interestingly.
Yeah. Which is a weird feeling, approving those people onto the form after
yes, and you're hiring for what? The things you laid off for? Goes back to my conspiracy theory at the beginning. And then finally, it's not a conspiracy theory. This is what I'm hearing from the ecosystem. And then finally, it seems to me that the larger you are, the larger a proportion of layoffs are because of the macroeconomic headwinds hitting you more. So the earlier you are, not to say you don't have to lay people off, but the ability to get funding and know where things are coming next is a little bit easier as you get smaller. So I have less of trouble theoretically raising funding than if I'm trying to raise a Series D and hire another 500 people tomorrow.
Rob, let me just say, if it's on a podcast, it's not a conspiracy theory. It's just
it was not a conspiracy theory. It was actually something. Yeah,
I'm here to entertain.
And Nora also put her finger up probably to correct 3/4 of what I said.
No, which is why I'm going back to it.
Yeah.
Does this idea resonate? Like, this isn't a real downturn because engineers aren't getting laid off? Or
that's
like
exactly how
does that resonate? Like, are you seeing, I don't know what you can share in relation to the companies that you work for, but I know you have a series of ravens throughout Canadian tech where you talk about people matters. Is it mostly just the non-technical people that are the first to be going here and no one's taking that super seriously? Is it an excuse to trim the fat? That was air quotes if no one could hear it. Is the mentality around these, forget the hiring component, there's the mentality around these layoffs similar to 2020 or just much more towards Rob's conspiracy, in-depth non-reporting?
Yeah, I like to think of myself as the raven, really. Yeah, no, I think that I think it's both actually. So I think it's a little cynical to say, hey, we're just trimming the fat. It has nothing to do with anything else. There's legitimate reasons for companies to need to cut back, but then there's certain positions that are easier to maybe let go of a little earlier, whether it's performance based or whether it's certain types of positions that are more focused on like niche particular areas of employee experience or recruiting if they're not doing as much hiring anymore.
Like diversity resource groups, maybe?
I mean, if those were paid, maybe.
Oh, jeez.
So essentially, there are real reasons behind this. Some of the ones that we've seen, kind of without naming names behind the scenes, are, for a lot of our clients, the cost of physical production, if they make a product, has gone up. For a lot of companies, although inflation is a thing these days and there are higher costs for either materials or salaries or all kinds of other things required to run the business, they haven't been able to increase their pricing, or there are just kind of supply chain issues. So there are all these kind of economic issues that feed into this. There are also a lot of companies that grew very, very quickly and had big bets on kind of continued high economic growth, especially if they have a product or service that was kind of pandemic boom related. And then, there has been sort of this case of, as I referenced in Meagan's article, this sort of case of funding musical chairs, right? Where in some cases, it just seems lucky if you raised a few months ago and got, the ink on the paper then versus a few weeks ago. Like we've seen some companies just have deals pulled at the very last second if they've had to reroute everything and make tough decisions because what they thought they had ahead of them, they suddenly didn't.
Yeah. Or they're just because of the timing of the matters, their runway to raise a new round it was 6 months out instead of a year out. And they have to give themselves time to make sure that they can get a term sheet signed and not be pulled or things like that. That makes sense. Meagan, from the reporting standpoint, like obviously I think the layoffs that we've covered have kind of come into two groups, which are a lot of companies kind of saying similar things to what Nora's been saying, around 10% of the total workforce, what is kind of our Mendoza line for whether or not this is like significant enough to be writing about rather than just possibly performance based or a couple other things. And then companies like the ones that we noted off the top, whether it's like Wealthsimple, Shopify, or Hootsuite, where it's a little bit more significant. And I would say particularly in Hootsuite's case, because man, right before the end of the year, we broke the news that they were trying to squeeze out an IPO before the holidays. And then fast forward 6 months later, they've let go a literal third of the company. And I don't know how that company is comprised, but I believe engineers were caught in that. Is there anything different in terms of what you're seeing here of the types of layoff stories they're reporting, or even more like how reporting these stories has changed?
I think there are definitely different types of layoffs. Like I think Shopify is a really good example. To Nora's point, right? This was during the pandemic. Shopify said, e-commerce, this is going to grow faster than we think it's going to do.
10 years ahead, leapfrog.
Yeah, right? That was Toby's bet. That was the bet that he, felt really bad about. And they grew really fast. They hired a lot of people, right? Like, when you talk about earlier stage startups that were looking to hire tech talent, they were worried about Shopify acquiring or taking all that talent, or like Facebook or Meta, right? Like, so that was a worry. So I think the Shopifys of the world grew really fast and they had to cut back. To Rob's point a little bit, almost every layoff I think that we covered, on some level, the company is saying it's related to the economy. Now, are they also telling us maybe one or two of those people was performance-based? Yeah, right? Like, it's not surprise. I don't think that it's mutually exclusive, but I would say just I haven't seen anyone not acknowledge the economy, right? So I think there's kind of two buckets there. You grew really fast, and then, yeah, you're a little bit smaller. Maybe you didn't grow as fast, but, you're still feeling the economy and what's going on there and taking advantage of that opportunity to maybe, I think, as Rob said, trim the fat a little bit.
Yeah, let's dig into that a little bit, because I wanted to ask Nora a bit about if the layoffs are being performed differently. And I hope this is where I hear they've been subscribing to your magazine and learning how to be human about this stuff. But then I'm also wondering about the messaging, because Meagan's really right. We actually had to sit Joshua Scott, reporter at BetaKit, down and tell him, if you write macroeconomic headwinds in a title again, we're going to have a problem, because that is the comment that we're getting back from each of these CEOs. And I have to think in some way it's related to the fact that when you have Toby Lutke, Mike Katchen, and Michelle Romanow all coming out and saying the economy is tough right now, that gives incredible cover to any a lower profile founder or smaller company to say, like, if this is impacting Shopify, if it's impacting these companies, who are we to not be caught up in this? So how much of this is narrative and wonderful narrative cover to make these decisions, and how much of this is just like, yeah, this is what's going down?
I think the founders that I've worked with have genuinely not wanted to do layoffs or let people go in any case. It was truly a down to the wire economic decision in the cases that I've seen. I wouldn't be surprised if there were, some conspiracy theories out there, but I think there's a bit of a bias because they'd probably be less likely to hire and work with me. I think in most cases, it has been genuinely that case. And, I think sometimes the messages of this can lead to certain types of panic as well in terms of headwinds, right? If venture capital sees a trend of, hey, other VCs are pulling investments, or they're not investing in this particular area of tech, or this is happening, it becomes this kind of hype cycle, right? Of, oh, maybe we should slow things down, or maybe we shouldn't spend too much money on, new partnerships or new products. And then that becomes a reality.
So the group think of Rob throwing out all those Web3 buzzwords, but only with like letting go of people. So there's a group think on cutbacks as much as there is acceleration.
I don't know about it's a group think on cutbacks. It's a group think on tightening wallets, and then the tightening wallets leads to cutbacks.
Rob, you have worked at companies before that have laid off people. I don't know if you've ever been directly involved with that stuff. Does that framework of cover track for you in terms of providing an opportunity to be making certain decisions, or is that not kind of the evaluation?
Well, I think like fundamentally, it takes time and effort to build a team, a lot of time and effort to build a team. And I think that you're going to try to keep the best talent and make decisions and help them grow as time passes. So you really don't want to be in a position where you lay people off. I think we saw in the last couple of years, especially, it's just been a tale of extremes. Unbelievable growth, unbelievable stopping of growth. And then the messed up part is we're in an economy right now where we're trying to slow it down because people have a little too much money and the GDP is actually okay, but we might enter a recession. So it's like a bit of a wacky, not a normal thing to be getting your tea leaves, figuring out what the heck is going on in the future. So I think I do agree, Nora, that I don't think anyone really wants to lay off anybody, certainly not en masse, because rebuilding that is going to take forever. It took a long time to build in the first place. It's very hard to fault anyone. I mean, I don't think anyone knew what the hell was going to happen, how long the pandemic was going to go on. No, I don't think no one expected everything to grind to a halt in the first quarter of the year. It's just not part of anyone's planning. So I think it's been dicey. And I do think that you can look to the later stage companies, but they do have a different set of pressures as you go down. So you can't say, well, Shopify laid off 1,000 people, but they're 15,000 people in their publicly traded company. And if you're like, I'm running a 30-person seed startup, it's really hard to juxtapose those two things together and draw patterns. Also, I agree with Nora. I think fear, like just as we can fear ourselves into a recession, we can fear ourselves into making bad decisions based on what the other is doing. And I think that's a dangerous place to be in. So I think
definitely
you have to
talked ourselves into COVID being over, right? And I agree that there's differences between like how Shopify approaches things and a 30-person company. I will say that not every layoff message or correspondence is created equal. And even the founders who are probably really sad, like they don't wake up every day and be like, yes, I laid off people today. I am hyped about this. In their statements, they've clearly indicated which type of people they want to keep at their company and which type they don't, which is maybe, a conversation for another day, because we're talking about the layoff stuff, but I want to get to the hiring thing because this is the prompt for this, the outreach. But first, I need to dig into this idea of if things are being done a little bit more differently, because, Meagan, I'll get you back in here. When we report on this stuff, how do I say this? How do I say this without bragging about something that's horrible? There have been many times at BetaKit where we have received words of layoffs, either right after they happened or while they were happening or right before they were about to happen. Often, sometimes in a pre-COVID environment, within like view of the office or into the office of the company doing it. We haven't generally, I would say, and let me know if you disagree, worked super hard to hunt these down. And certainly in 2020, every company was kind of proactively out there making very dramatic decisions. Has that been the vibe so far in 2022 or this summer fallow period? Because it seems to me like it's been a little bit, there's been fewer and fewer lists of very talented employees going around, that founders who are beating their chest, they're so disappointed they had to let them go, are trying to get rehired. And a lot more like we're knocking on their door being like, hey, we know about the layoffs that you made 3 weeks ago that no one seems to be talking about. Does that track for you? Like, how have you been approaching reporting these stories? And is it different from 2020 in that way?
Yeah, I think it's really interesting. I think I'm seeing a mix this time around. I'm seeing a mix of companies being really proactive and public and saying, hey, we've had to make layoffs. This is what's going on. We want to help our employees as much as possible, and kind of go through and be really proactive about like the positive stuff that they might still be doing even during that hard situation. But we are still seeing companies who don't want to talk about it as much, right? And are keeping it a little bit more quiet. Whereas I think in the past, in 2020, you would see a bit more, I don't want to say more layoffs, because I don't know. You know what I mean? I haven't counted how many layoffs we covered in 2020 versus what we're covering now. It seemed like a lot. It also seemed like we were doing them almost every day then, right? But I think people were being a little more public about it, a lot of social media posts, again, with those like spreadsheets of like, here's the talent and you can find them. But prior to COVID, people were a little bit more quiet, and we were kind of hearing about things as they're happening, and then
didn't want to be singled out, maybe
didn't want to be singled out. And so I feel like COVID layoffs, I guess we want to call it that, like created a bit more space for companies, if they're willing to be out there and chatting like, hey, we had to make layoffs, we're just going to be proactive, out and open. And some who are kind of reverting back to like the pre-COVID, don't want to talk about this. So I feel like I'm seeing a mix.
So what about at the employee level? Because I think obviously, by one comparison, the help list was spawned in 2020 as this great way to showcase people who have been laid off, which mostly seemed to be a meta compilation of what each company normally individually did. We got a spreadsheet together, contact the HR person at the company who didn't get laid off to get access to that. They're going to work with people to try and get those laid off rehired. Going back to 2015, 2014, that's been a common practice in Canadian tech. But you'd also see many more employees kind of doing work, being laid off or having not been laid off, indicating that their team members had been laid off, sharing that out and trying to help. Has the employee communication at that level changed?
I would say so, as social media becomes more and more part of our everyday. Not that it wasn't. I feel like, employees on that employee level are being more proactive, saying, hey, I've been laid off, as well as a bunch of people. But yeah, Nora, I was actually going to ask, like, kind of interested in what you're seeing on that level and how employees are kind of responding. Because I know in the past, some people have been like pretty upset about how companies handled layoffs versus now. Maybe it seems a little different from my perspective, but you would know more.
Yeah, I think in the past few years, obviously social media has been around for quite a long time, but in the past few years, there's been so much more discussion about, what good management looks like, what good hiring looks like, subsequently, what good firing looks like, what good work and candidate experiences, all of those things. So it still kind of makes it a candidates market, even though there's more candidates looking right now, not just kind of the fear of being canceled on Twitter, but just more awareness of good practices, or a combination of both. So I think based on those things, companies are being, a little more careful about their communications, whether it's to employees when it's happening, planning it out a little better, making sure it's, a slightly better experience. So even if they're not necessarily putting out, one of those Google Sheets of who's available, I think there's more companies that are doing a bit of a better job of making these a little more human than maybe a few years ago.
Okay. Do those best practices now include maybe more directly enforcing binding agreements, preventing employees from saying anything lest they lose their termination package? Because I know at least some people, and I can't even like hint at who we've spoken to, have been absolutely deathly afraid of making any comment anywhere at any point in time under risk or threat of losing whatever it was presented into them the moment they got laid off. Is that bit of consideration? Is that, maybe not with your clients, but a conversation that you hear amongst your crew of people advisors?
They're nothing new. They're standard. They've always been there. Every lawyer will put those into every single dismissal agreement. And I've never worked anywhere or with any company where that was not a standard in a dismissal package. It's not new.
Is there a sense, though, that it's being more enforced? Or because the feel seems that, and maybe this is to Megan's point on the social media stuff, but the fear seems more palpable about the risk of speaking to a publication like ours.
I don't think so. I think people have always been hesitant to break a contract and potentially lose a large amount of money that may be especially important to them at this moment. I don't think that's anything new. I think that there's a whole conversation as to whether these clauses should be included in dismissal paperwork. And, maybe that's something that a brave progressive company might evolve beyond or decide not to do. But it has been standard for a really long time, and they have been scaring people out of discussing these situations for a long time.
Do you know that more and more tech leaders, and I'm talking absolute giants, have been making the same discovery? It's Linebox Studio, the architectural firm that has become the dominant force in designing offices and headquarters for serious IT firms. Shopify, Element AI, Clipfolio, Benchside, Gsoft, and now Hootsuite have learned that a great team and groundbreaking work gets inspiration from what surrounds them. Linebox has designed winning environments for all of those companies. Are you their next success story? Find out at linebox.ca.
I'm curious to sort of take the conversation in a slightly different direction. The labor market is crazy right now, generally in Canada, which is interesting. Going back to my point about this isn't the normal kind of slowdown, so that's not helping situations. I'm curious if you have clients or have you seen patterns that differ between Canadian and US-based firms and how they are hiring, firing their teams, because it seems like the US was sort of leading the trend in terms of numbers of layoffs across company sets and across the volume. There seemed to be a higher number. Obviously, there's more venture-backed companies in the States than in Canada. I'm curious to know whether the differences in the patterns in terms of like number of jobs slashed / number of companies that are actually doing the layoffs. Like, do you see a difference in the ecosystems, or is it about the same?
I would say it's about the same. I haven't seen too much of a difference there.
Do you think that is telling in any way, shape, or form? Or is it just like, yeah, that's the tech sector slowing down for the first time for 5 minutes?
I think there's more globalization right now, especially in terms of investment and then also in terms of talent. Companies in the US can hire Canadians, and Canadians can hire Americans, and we have Canadian companies that are, venture backed by American companies, and not really vice versa. But yeah, I think things are starting to globalize a little more. So I have not seen quite as much of a difference.
The other thing I'm curious about is from a salary perspective, I was kind of expecting, notwithstanding maybe let's not just totally focus on pure developer salaries, but I was kind of expecting developer salaries to sort of soften a little bit. That doesn't seem to be the case, at least from my anecdotal observation. Is that something you're seeing as well? Which you'd think that people are laying off. Oh, there's more supply, but it seems like, going back to my first point, there's like 0.7 jobs available for or the other way around, whatever the good one is, where you have 0.7 available people for every one job or something like that across Canada. Or is that what it is? It's just a supply crunch, even though there's some softening, do you think? Or are you seeing that prices are actually going down for talent, or is it still a seller's market?
Yeah, so they're not going down yet. So compensation is a huge topic on our team. We do a lot of compensation work and research. And yeah, so I think, budget is a concern in terms of hiring and hiring pace for a lot of our clients. So we're still kind of in a hangover or a lack of slowdown from the really high increases over the past year or so. After the Great Resignation and talent shortages, it seems like salaries in tech, developer salaries, but also basically everything else, seem to jump every 2 or 3 months instead of every 6 months, just at this accelerated pace. And we haven't seen them go down yet. We haven't seen them rise again, but we haven't seen them go down yet. So I think employees still have, higher expectations based on that, based on high, inflation and higher cost of living. And then also just more options, right? If they've been working from home for the past couple of years, why not apply to, a FANG company? Why not, et cetera. So I think all of those things contribute. Maybe I would give it more time to see if other factors lead to a bit of a salary slowdown, but I haven't seen it yet.
Yeah, it's interesting. because we've been talking about the layoff side, but from the hiring perspective, the actual list that we've been able to compile at BetaKit or that we've offered up that people have contributed to, it's more robust than I think we expected, just in the sense that well, first of all, we compiled a list of maybe, I think, 175 companies on the onset, just based upon Meagan's initial prompt. And then we opened up a form for other companies to submit. We're about 350 now, but only of those net new submissions are we tracking certain things that we allowed companies to add after the fact that we didn't initially add into the data set. One of them being size of company hiring. And it was very interesting to me to see 18 companies of 1,000 employees or more hiring, 35 companies in the 250 to 1,000 range hiring, and then 42 in 100 to 250. The spread of the interest right now seems not gated to a certain stage. I was actually surprised at the extent to which companies of less than 10 aren't as represented, but that, again, that might be included in the data set of who we were compiling previously. The geographical spread of this has been entirely across Canada. There literally has been no specific call out to one archetype or role that we can see so far, that we're going to do a little bit more data analysis as this thing progresses. Meagan, maybe this is a good place to ask you this question. When you, because I know we talked about this really, really early on, how are we going to format this in a BetaKit article initially?
Pivot tables.
Dude, we were we are words people. We were definitely not thinking of Airtable or even a spreadsheet of that. We're not data analysts. But I'm wondering broadly, when you put out the ask, because I want to get this to the positive side of the hiring, because we did the dour thing up front, the layoff focus. But there are 350 companies looking to hire a junk ton of roles right now. So when you put out the initial ask, what kind of response were you expecting? Not even in amount, but even in just engagement. And then did that change in any way as of today?
I don't know if I had an expectation going into it. I kind of said, you know what, let's put it out there and just see, right? I don't know. I know a lot of companies are saying that they're feeling the crunch, but I have a feeling that there are maybe a lot more, or a good number that aren't. So I don't know if I had an expectation, but the tweet got so much more engagement than I thought it would. And I think it still is today. I've done a couple follow-ups, showing here's the list, the article and all that kind of stuff. And it continues to get engagement, right? People are really hey, my company's hiring. I'm gonna join the list. Or I get emails even.
Yeah, we just had IBM add themselves today. And it's kind of okay, IBM has entered the chat. They're paying attention to this little outreach thing that we did.
Yeah, so it was definitely much bigger than I kind of expected it to be. But I think on the other hand, with these layoffs, that means there's more tech talent. There's been the past couple of years where there's this crunch of tech talent, right? Where no one can hire engineers, though engineers are being as affected apparently during this set of layoffs. But people are looking for tech talent, right? And they haven't been able to find it. And now there's a bit more talent that companies can pick from the pool. So I think it's really interesting. That was literally the number one thing before everyone started being worried, early this year. I said, some people are starting to whisper about the economy. Are you worried? No, I just need talent.
Yes. VCs were worried about their portfolio companies not being able to raise a round or a bridge round. And all the CEOs we were talking to were I still just need to hire, which might be a trailing indicator because those companies are, laying people off and hiring at the same time. But when we discussed formatting this, we were even if we just had a couple headers where we're 4 or 5 companies in Western Canada, Central Canada, and let's make sure we got Atlantic Canada representing here. Just a couple different companies representing the spread of Canada. This might be a positive thing just for people to as a reminder. And then it was oh my God, we've been subsumed by the weight of kind of requests. Nora, obviously we're dealing with a limited data set here based upon a form submission that I hacked together over a weekend. Is there anything that you're seeing when it comes to types of companies hiring or anything in that regards that might be useful for our listeners to kind of hear about?
Yeah. So, what I'm seeing trend-wise in terms of companies that are hiring actively and not doing any layoffs, really, from kind of my limited view as well, is, basically tools and products that people need to use regardless of the pandemic and regardless of the economy. So just kind of your typical things like your Dropbox or your Slack or things that are just kind of already ingrained. Also, speaking of Dropbox and Slack, ones that serve remote work, which really isn't going anywhere. So companies and tools that are enabling that. A lot of AI I've seen on your list, and then also in my experience as well, seeing a lot of AI companies continue to grow and companies in the quantum computing space. And then even lots of HR tech. So we talked about the advent of kind of better people experience and taking better care on that front, or facilitating remote work or facilitating hiring anywhere in the world. And so there's a lot of HR tech that's still growing. Those are the types of companies that generally we're seeing trend on the up and avoid layoffs. And really be hiring. And then, of course, anyone who managed to close all their funding before all the weirdness.
Yeah, that might be the true lesson of the spreadsheet. It's like when you close your round, you're good. Or, hey, Canadians are good at SaaS and everyone likes SaaS, baby. B2B SaaS is going to keep hiring because they're going to keep making money.
Yeah, if you manage to secure any money that didn't go to Adam Newman, you're good.
I'm wondering, maybe Nora, because we interviewed you for this story and you were very helpful in setting the current moment in context, but even seeing is this response and the number of companies hiring and what they're hiring for interesting to you in your role? Are there any takeaways that you've derived from that give better insights from just a people perspective?
Yeah, no, so I did have a chance to look at the table on there, and it corresponds with what we are seeing in the market as well. I think companies are still really focusing their hiring on a lot more technical roles, which is interesting. And I'm not really surprised. And, I think that that's not an indicator of value necessarily, but it's just that these roles have been traditionally harder to hire. So I think they're thinking, hey, if things pick back up again, like Rob was saying earlier, they kind of want to hang on to those and continuing to hire in those areas. And they want to move the product forward as well. So those don't surprise me. I think one of the hardest hit areas was probably on the people side. A lot of recruiters, I feel like, you couldn't find or hire a recruiter to save your life a few months ago, like I mentioned. And I feel like almost all of the companies that did layoffs let go of their recruiters, which I think is
Even
an
Apple.
interesting.
Apple letting go of recruiters is something I haven't heard of since the mid 2000s.
So that's kind of a canary in a coal mine too, because, what does that tell you? That they're not planning on hiring as much, right? They have less hiring work to do. And they've looked ahead and kind of anticipated that. So
yeah, it's almost like Shopify employees finding out that hiring is going to slow your company might be an indicator that something's around the corner. People who are upset us for reporting that story.
Who recruits the recruiters? That's what I would do. Do they have a recruiter session? It's kind of really confusing. Okay. Anyway, I'm just being stupid.
It's not stupid. Meagan, how many times have we been in a situation where we reach out to the point of contact for everything with the company and then we find out that they've been laid off along with everyone else and we're like, who do we contact?
Yeah.
So an HR rite of passage when you've been around long enough is being asked to write or check your own termination paperwork. It's happened to almost all
meta.
of us.
And then you get a watch and a cake.
Those are the trenches when you do a layoff and then they ask you to do your own.
Yeah, I was in the last tech bust in 2007 and I had to lay off the entire company and I was the last person to lay myself off. So I felt a little less bad because I'm like, you're all being fired, but I'm being fired too.
And Rob loves yelling at himself in the mirror. And
yeah, I was the
fingers,
meanest to myself. I'm like, you get nothing. But we had a long runway, so people had long heads up. The other thing but isn't that a more humane way to do it? Going back to the Apple thing, or going back to, not that it's good to lay anyone off, but if you're not recruiting any further, rather than hiring and firing indiscriminately, isn't it kind of better to not just hire indiscriminately? It sounds like people are being more deliberate with their hiring and then therefore not firing. Not to say that, on the other hand, that you're not going to want to hire them 5 minutes later when you're going to need to recruit again.
This is the whole reason I think why we're having this podcast. Not only because of the reaction, but when you try to set this thing in context, it's like, okay, there's a lot of layoffs going on. It's been a summer of layoffs, but they're not as bad as 2020. And from what we've seen, tons of people are hiring. But there's still a slowdown. No one can get paper. Nothing can get shipped. We're worried about inflation. Large parts of the world are on fire. Apple is getting rid of recruiters, which never happens. There are too many leaves of tea here to read. And I'm all about the vibe check. And I'm struggling to get a sense of the vibe, particularly since we're recording this at the end of summer. You'll be listening to this sometime after Labor Day, fall back to school. I hope you got the great fall fit. This has been such a weird 2-year period where we haven't had a summer break because either everyone was getting laid off or all the capital in the world was being deployed. And this slowdown was really sad. I don't know how the year closes out. Maybe I think about this too much in terms of narrative, but I'm really struggling to contextualize the moment because this was what the response that we saw from our little, like, let's just try to make people feel better because we feel bad about reporting about bad things, was not what we expected. Nora, what should we be taking away from this moment? Everyone's going to go, we're going to run down, we're going to do a podcast-wide vibe check, starting with Nora.
Yeah, I think maturity is the vibe.
I love that for us.
Yeah, blowing the entire investment bag on absolutely wild bets. Maybe not, over hiring. And like Rob was saying, hiring a little bit more slowly and deliberately. Maybe salary and hiring markets shaking out a bit with, remote work and globalization. Perhaps we're just headed to a more mature state and not doom and gloom.
Meagan, what's your vibe check?
I agree. I think that even kind of what Nora was saying goes back to the point where you were asking me, Douglas, what are the vibe of the layoffs now versus 2020, right? And I kind of said it's a meld of pre-COVID and COVID. And I think that probably does point to some maturation. People being more willing to talk about their layoffs or, treating employees in a certain way when they're doing it, right? So, you know what? I think Nora brings up a pretty good point, and I'm going to agree.
We can't bring you on the podcast just to have you agree with someone else on the podcast, Meagan.
She is the subject matter expert, so.
Rob, are we gonna run the table here with a positive, mature ecosystem vibe check here?
I guess so. I mean, it does make a lot of sense.
I don't want to do it. I'm usually really grumpy on this podcast, but I guess I have to. Nora made a really good point.
I'm shaking my fist at the cloud. Nora, I think to even extend that, it's like, I agree with the maturity stuff. And that's going even back up the stack to investors, right? Investors used to fight over deals without even reading the pieces of paper. And now they're like, let me just read this 3 times before offering company. You know what I mean? So there's a maturity up and down the stack, not just in hiring. But I would say that this feels weird and different. There's all these indicators are going on in random different directions, which is like GDP is great, but somehow we're laying off people. And the same people who are laying off people are on the list. And I think we're going to go into a recession next year, and money's worth less, but you can't get money if you want. So I'm kind of confused. Honestly, the list is much bigger than I expected. It feels good to see that people are still hiring, that our ecosystem is still chugging along. It looks like we're at the other end of other side of the hump of the technical transformation of our economy. We're not obviously there yet, but the fact that there are so many tech jobs means that we have a tech industry in this country that's really good. But I'm really confused because I really don't know what to make of it. I don't know what would happen in December. I honestly don't know. So it seems like good vibes, but I legit have we can come back in 3 months and it could be on fire, and I wouldn't be surprised.
So maturity is confusing?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. I'm not sure what to do with these emotions. What do you think, Douglas, with your bird's eye view?
I'm just as confused because I do see these things in terms of narrative. And when it was suggested to me that we compile this data into an Airtable, I literally spat. So not having seasonality to this ecosystem, not being able to, say 2 is a coincidence, 3 is a trend. I'm not sure which way the wind is blowing. I think it's blowing in a lot of different directions. So the idea that there's some return to sanity in that, like our previous episode, we just had like a US-based VC working with a bunch of Canadian accelerators trying to explain to startups that no, revenue generation has always been a thing. You need to stop chasing the narrative. And I think I'm maybe just there with that, but I don't want to say I feel unsettled by a positive response. And possibly by the time you hear this, if you're listening a little bit later, by the end of the month of September, it's very likely that there could be 500 companies advertising the fact that they're hiring. Now, how many of those companies by that time are truly hiring, are winning those offers, where that talent's going, remains to be seen. I think we're going to have to check in on that, but that's kind of what we do on the podcast anyways, right? So I guess I'm being comfortable with discomfort, and that's a sign of maturity.
You're the most mature person I know.
That is both not true and possibly an interesting prompt for a whole other podcast that we will not be releasing. Nora, if people are like, she seems really smart and I want her to help my company either get rid of people or find new people or possibly treat my current employees well, where can they find you?
You can find us at brightandearly.ca or check us out at earlymagazine.com to learn how to do things better yourself.
Meagan, because you don't tweet enough, they're not going to find you on Twitter. Where else could our listeners find you if they wanted to learn more about all the incredibly tense and difficult stories that you're forced to report on at a weekly cadence?
Well, you can find me on Twitter, Douglas, at Meagan E. Simpson. And you can also find me on LinkedIn.
LinkedIn really blowing up for us right now. I wonder why. And then I guess Rob Kennedy, we just leave you trapped
See
in
you
a
next
box
week.
until the next episode
I just
comes
live
out, right?
inside of this Zoom audio podcast.
Do you want to tease the 40-year-old founder series that we're going to be launching soon? Do you want to give any information? No, absolutely not.
No. I don't want my premature layoff for my own company.
Well, then on your behalf, I will note that, hey, BetaKit is hiring. So possibly along with this episode, you might see a few job recs that we're going to put out. The BetaKit podcast is produced by BetaKit Incorporated. It's edited by Katie Lohr, and its hosts are Rob Kennedy and me, Douglas Saltis. To learn more about how you can support this podcast, head to patreon.com/BetaKit.